Greetings and welcome to another lecture in psychopathology. In this particular lecture, we're going to be continuing to talk about potential causes or triggers or factors involved in schizophrenia. As I've mentioned before, this seems to be a biological disorder, and it seems to be one that affects the brain. And there is a long list of brain issues that are correlated with schizophrenia, the leading one of which is a loss of volume. Normally, our brains fit very snugly into our skulls. There aren't a whole lot of empty spaces. There's not a whole lot of empty passages within. We do have passages through our brain called the ventricles and such, but they're generally relatively small. We fill our heads up pretty good. But people who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia very often show a loss of brain volume. They often show enlarged ventricles. That is almost always a sign that there has been some loss of brain neurons when the ventricles get larger. That's been seen in people with head injuries. It's been seen in people with things like encephalitis, where again the brain is damaged, and it's also seen in schizophrenia. There's also a decline in the gray matter. Brains are made up of two broad categories of matter. There is white matter, which is usually myelinated axons, which is where information is sent from one neuron to another, and gray matter, which is usually cell bodies, and where all the functions of the cells are located. And so what we're seeing here is a loss in gray matter, a loss in the cell bodies. Without cell bodies, there's no neuron. So that definitely is a sign that neurons are vanishing, essentially. What's very interesting is that this loss of volume for the brain and large ventricles and such are even seen in monozygotic, identical twins who have not been diagnosed with schizophrenia. If one twin has and the other hasn't, the one that hasn't been diagnosed still has this loss of volume, which really does make it look like that might be one of the pre-existing factors that go into it. Specifically, the losses seem to be in the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes. And this is probably also not a coincidence. This makes sense because these two lobes are kind of specialized. The frontal lobe is where we do a lot of decision making. And people with schizophrenia are not known for their good decision making. They tend to be impulsive. They tend to make decisions that are really not based on anything valid. The temporal lobes are where hearing takes place. And it turns out that most of the hallucinations that people with schizophrenia have are auditory. The vast majority of hallucinations, the most common hallucinations, are auditory hallucinations. People hear things. People hear voices talking to them, telling them things. So it kind of makes sense that the problems would be in the areas for decision making and the auditory processing. This includes the amygdala, which of course is used for emotion. A lot of people with schizophrenia have problems with emotion. The hippocampus, which is memory. And the thalamus, which does a whole lot of things, but among other things is the way station for other sensations, which is where other types of hallucinations might actually come into play. Now, the gray matter is essentially where a lot of the decline is taking place, that a lot of the early attention was given to gray matter. But we're also seeing decline in white matter, in those myelinated axons, which shows that the parts of the brain might become disconnected from the body as well as from itself, which may explain some of the problems with thought and the problems with thinking and the other things, that the lack that we see with negative symptoms. It could definitely explain some of those things that are going on in terms of people with schizophrenia. So with this loss of volume, we do see actual brain impairment, brain problems with frontal and temporal that goes along very nicely with that loss of matter. Now, what might be causing this? What might be part of that whole diathesis part, the pre-existing part, is there's an idea of what might be going on in that prenatal period to cause all of these problems later on. Because as I mentioned before, in the prenatal period is when the blueprint for the brain is laid down and also where the structure begins to be built. And that's what's happening during that apparent critical period at the end of the first and the beginning of the second trimester. The structure of the brain, where each neuron goes, is very, very precise. This isn't just a free-for-all. Neurons go to specific places to do specific things. And that structure is called the cytoarchitecture of the brain. And it's possible that in people with schizophrenia, part of the problem is the neurons are not migrating properly. They're not going to the right place. If they don't go to the right place, they're not going to get connected. If they're not going to get connected, then they may not survive. They may wind up being pruned. We'll talk about pruning in just a little bit. So that could definitely be a problem. There also may be a lack of interneurons. Interneurons do not connect brain to muscle or sense organ to brain. Interneurons connect neurons to neurons. Maybe not surprisingly given the name. And a lot of times interneurons are inhibitory. They prevent or slow down that neuron from firing, which sends a different signal because how neurons signal is their rate of firing. So maybe this lack of inhibitory neurons is causing some of the problems with the brain, particularly maybe positive symptoms, or maybe it could have a problem with dopamine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. As I mentioned a minute ago, something very interesting happens. It happens once around 2 years, 1 to 2 years of age, and that happens again during adolescence. What happens during these periods is what's called neural Darwinism. Essentially, neurons that are not being used are pruned, are discarded, are eliminated. Newborn babies very often have, their brains are so large in comparison to their bodies. And so it's possible that they are born, we think that they're born with too many neurons, essentially. And the connection is a bit haphazard. Those that don't get connected wind up getting pruned. So maybe what goes on in people with schizophrenia, perhaps they had a fewer number of neurons to begin with, and the normal pruning during those 2 periods pruned too much. It hacked it down to the stump, if we go on with the pruning metaphor. Maybe that explains why children who later go on to be diagnosed with schizophrenia often show somewhat abnormal behavior. Maybe they've been over-pruned. And then the second pruning that happens during adolescence is when things really start to get chopped down. Remember, particularly for males, schizophrenia tends to show up in late adolescence, early adulthood. And it also tends to be worse than for females. Maybe males in particular get over-pruned. Also, if a person undergoes a head injury, a concussion, or any kind of brain injury in early adolescence, that should be adolescence, that also increases the risk of schizophrenia. That should be schizophrenia. Sorry, I apparently lost my ability to spell. Hopefully it's not over pruning. Bad joke. Get back to the seriousness. Head injuries in early adolescence are correlated with schizophrenia. Head injuries often cause a loss of neurons. So maybe a loss of neurons during the normal pruning times causes more neurons that would normally be pruned to be pruned. Basically, they're overdoing it. All of these are possibilities. We don't know for sure. Okay? Quite frankly, we don't know a lot for sure, but we're going with what we do know, which is not a lot. That's why these are correlations. We also suspect there's something going on with the neurochemistry of the brain, specifically with one particular neurotransmitter called dopamine. The dopamine hypothesis is one of the older theories of schizophrenia. It's one of the older biological theories of schizophrenia. And this is at least partly because people with schizophrenia who are treated with drugs that reduce dopamine tend to have their symptoms reduced as well. So if we reduce the amount of dopamine in the brain, people with symptoms of schizophrenia start to do better. In addition, it does look like some people with schizophrenia, now that we can do things like the PET scans and the fMRIs and stuff, it does look like people with schizophrenia may have overactive dopamine neurons. Maybe too much is being created. Maybe too much is being released. Maybe not enough is being recycled. We talked a little about dopamine reuptake. Maybe it's not being recycled. For whatever reason, it does appear, at least for some people, that the symptoms are connected with too much dopamine. A similar hypothesis is, as I mentioned before, perhaps not enough being recycled. Similar hypothesis is the glutamate hypothesis. Now, glutamate is essentially an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It calms things down. The more glutamate you have, the calmer things tend to get. We do know that people who take too much of certain types of drugs that affect glutamate, like PCP and ketamine, those block glutamate receptors, and they also cause schizophrenia type symptoms. Now, they don't cause schizophrenia per se, because these are caused by a drug. That means that it's not schizophrenia. It's because it's caused by this drug. Schizophrenia is something that isn't caused by a drug. So, maybe there's something going on in terms of not enough glutamate, not enough of this inhibitory stuff. And guess what? We know, interestingly enough, that ketamine only does this in adults. You can actually give ketamine to children, and it's a tranquilizer, and it will work. They'll be okay. But adults, no. Adults, it's a whole different kettle of fish. Maybe because children have more neurons, because they haven't been fully pruned. We don't know. But we do know that dopamine suppresses glutamate. So the more dopamine you have, the less glutamate generally you have. So what might be going on here basically is person has too much dopamine. Dopamine suppresses glutamate. The dopamine causes excitatory impulses in the brain, and the lack of glutamate also causes excitatory impulses, and the brain just kind of goes out of control. Again, hypothesis, but it makes sense. And in some ways, that's pretty much all that we have. Now, there are some suggestions on psychosocial and cultural factors, and I'm going to get to those in the next slide because there's a lot of them.